So I'd like to focus in on a couple of specific takeaways, a couple of lessons that we might draw from some of this. One of the questions that I've heard raised, that I saw shared with us, was the question of, well, how do you know that the Orthodox tradition is the true church, right? Why that tradition as opposed to a different type of tradition? And this I think we've already touched on. I touched on in my own story this critical question of what is Christianity? Right? What is it? Is Christianity just an empty bag in which we can put any number of things in? And if we put in this doctrine, then because it's in the bag, it's Christianity? Or we can take it out and put in this doctrine instead, and it's in the bag, so it's now Christianity. Or is Christianity have some sort of core essential truth that runs through it consistently? As I had said, when I looked at the history of Western Christianity, what I saw was I didn't see any level of continuity. The entire history of Western Christianity seemed to be a history of innovation and of dispute. I recognized when I looked at Western Christianity, you could identify the points at which certain new doctrines were introduced. You could identify the points at which the discussion definitively changed. You could trace the point to who introduced this unique and innovative doctrine here. You could identify the different schools, and you could point to all the ways in which all of the schools disagreed, that there was no point of continuity through any of them. But what I found, what stood out to me, and what continues to stand out to me about the Orthodox tradition, about the Orthodox faith, is this. Paul talks about handing something down, right? This is what the word tradition means, right? Paradosis. The Greek word paradosis refers to, or translated tradition, is that which is handed down. Jude talks about a faith that is once given over to the saints. And what I see is that when I look at the various histories of Christianity, the various facets of the history of Christianity, there is only one tradition that I see. There is only one tradition that I see that consistently, from start to finish, has a clear and consistent answer. What is Christianity? The Orthodox tradition, unlike every other tradition, can trace its understanding of the Christian faith, its understanding of man, its understanding of the incarnation, its understanding of the Trinity, its understanding of the gospel itself. It can trace those all the way down to the Apostolic Fathers. And it can point to the way in which there is unbroken tradition from father to father to father to father. That is extraordinarily unique. And as I said, I think this can be defended just on the one hand as a historical fact. We can look and trace from the fathers to the fathers to the fathers, and we can see the ways in which the doctrine is unbroken. We can see the ways in which the understanding of Christianity and the Christian gospel in the East is consistent from start to finish. But I also would point out the very thing that I had mentioned when talking about my own journey, that this stands out as so singularly unique in human history that I see no other way of interpreting it other than as a miracle. There is no philosophical tradition that remains unbroken and unchanged and without innovation and dispute like that within the history of ideas. Western Christianity also has no such claim to where it can point to an unbroken tradition that way. That type of consistent protection of a certain set of ideas is singularly unique in the history of ideas and within religion itself. And I point to it because I think it is proof itself of a divine providential miracle, a care for God's church. And the reason I think that's significant is that's exactly what Christ promises the Holy Spirit will do, that it will lead you into all truth. And so when we look at the Orthodox tradition and we identify this unbroken chain from father to father to father, preserved throughout the councils, I think this is itself a historical proof for the claim of the Orthodox faith that it is the true faith, preserved from the start until the present, that which is handed down and unbroken. I'll also say along these lines, sometimes there are folks who will attack that claim, and they'll try to suggest that the church fathers are not so consistent as somebody like myself would claim. I find this, and here I'll speak as a scholar, I find that these are exaggerated differences. So, for example, some people will point to the fact that throughout the church fathers, sometimes you see differences in language. I'll give you an example. At the Council of Nicaea, right, the first ecumenical council, there is an anathema, right, where the church declares that it is anathema, that it is a condemned saying to say that there are three hypostases, is the Greek word. And then if you're familiar with Constantinople later, when they talk about the Trinity, they declare that the Trinity is three hypostases. Right? That's the word oftentimes translated person. Now, you could point to this and you could say that this is an innovation, right? That this is a change, that at Nicaea, people denied that there were three hypostases. In Constantinople, they affirmed that these are three hypostases. But what we have to understand here is the shift here is not actually a shift in content. It's not a shift in doctrine. The shift here is a shift in language. So in the Greek language, there was a time where the terms ousia and hypostasis could be used interchangeably. And let me here contextualize this. When we talk about the Trinity, the basic confession of the Trinity, that we have three persons and one nature or essence, that is, the terms are three hypostases and one ousia. And that's what's declared at Constantinople. But prior to Constantinople, prior to this formula, this way of talking about the Trinity, the Greek words ousia and hypostasis were interchangeable. They were synonyms. You could use ousia to refer to a person. You could use ousia to refer to a nature. You could use hypostasis to refer to a person. You could use hypostasis to refer to a nature. And we actually have the letter where Basil of Caesarea says the fact that these words are interchangeable is causing confusion. And so Basil says that for the sake of clarity, we will no longer use the word hypostasis to refer to nature. We'll only use ousia to refer to nature. We'll use hypostasis to refer to person. And for the first time, these words are separated and no longer interchangeable. That's a shift in language. It's not a shift in content. And so sometimes folks from certain traditions that don't like the claim that I just made, there are Protestants, for example, who recognize that it is a threat to their tradition to identify an unbroken chain of theology, of a faith handed down from church father to church father. And so they will attack the claim that the church fathers agree. Or perhaps sometimes Roman Catholics who recognize that the consistency of the Eastern Fathers is a threat to their claims as Roman Catholics. You'll have scholars try to attack the continuity of the Church Fathers and claim that there is no consensus, that there is not an agreement, that the sort of thing that I described is not real. And my point in bringing this out is I did not read the Eastern Church Fathers as someone from an Orthodox tradition with an axe to grind. I was not looking to demonstrate that the Eastern Church Fathers agreed. I read the Eastern Church Fathers, and in reading the Eastern Church Fathers from the 1st century through the 8th century, I recognized they all agreed. It was simply by reading them it became apparent that they all agreed. And when I read the challenges to the claim that they agreed from Protestants or from Catholics, what always became clear to me was that these folks who were making this attack were trying to exaggerate differences. They were trying to create differences where there were not differences. And the reason they wanted to create differences was because they recognized that that unbroken chain of orthodoxy is a threat to their tradition. They recognized that if what I saw in the Eastern Church Fathers is true, and it is true, then that itself is proof that they are the true faith. They have the true faith. They are the true church. And that's the thing that I recognize. So when answering the question, how do you know which tradition to rely upon? I think the answer is simply this. Christ promises to lead that the Holy Spirit will lead us into all truth. Paul implores us to preserve what has been handed down. Jude talks about a faith once given over to the saints. So the very simple question is this: is the faith being described? Is the faith being described something that's there from the start, or is it not? And the fact of the matter is that only Eastern Orthodoxy, only the Orthodox faith is there from the start and consistently handed down from generation to generation. Luther's gospel emerges with Luther. Thomas Aquinas' theology emerges with Thomas Aquinas. The innovations of Augustine emerge with Augustine. In all of these different schools of Western Christianity, you can pinpoint those later stages at which doctrines are introduced, innovation occurs, and new theology emerges. And only in the Eastern Church Fathers do you see a consistent and unbroken chain from the start until the present day. And that's what I would point to as the answer for how we look at, how we identify what the true faith is handed down. Let me talk a little bit also about what it means to have a consensus of the Fathers. Because it is true, the Fathers do not agree on every single thing, right? We can find certain points at which there are differences. I'll give you an example of a couple of differences on tangential matters. Are angels redeemable? Are fallen angels redeemable? And you find 3 different answers in the Church Fathers to this question. One answer to this question is that angels are not redeemable because they are simple. So this is something that you can find in John of Damascus, for example, where he says, well, we all know that angels, because they're simple, if they go awry, they can't be fixed. Now the background here is actually the very thing that I talked about when I had mentioned the unmaking of man. So you remember that when we talked about the corruption of man, the fall of man, the distorting of our natures, and the fact that in some ways humanity needs to be unmade, the body being turned back to dust, so that we can be redeemed and remade. John of Damascus's point is that angels don't have a body. So if they're corrupted, they can't be taken apart and fixed. They can't be disassembled and reassembled the way humanity can. And so John of Damascus suggests that they can't be redeemed. Pseudo-Dionysius, on the other hand, suggests that corruption can never be permanent. And the reason he suggests that corruption can't be permanent is because he suggests that a state of rest occurs only when something arrives at its proper end. So if we're, say, moving a shape towards being spherical, we can come to a state of rest and completion when it is perfectly spherical. But as long as it's divergent, that's an unstable state. There's any number of ways in which you can diverge from proper formation, but there's only one way in which you can converge on proper formation. Or to put it another way, there are innumerable ways of misdrawing a triangle, right? Of distorting a triangle. There's only one proper way of drawing a triangle, right? Something like that. And so Pseudo-Dionysius suggests that corruption, because it's divergence, it's inherently unstable. And so because it's unstable, it's the sort of thing that can be redeemed. It can be fixed. It's never static. And so Pseudo-Dionysius seems to think that the angels can be redeemed because corruption is something that is in an unstable state. And then the third answer to that question you find from somebody like Nemesius of Emesa. So Nemesius of Emesa, presumably based on the book of Enoch, ends up suggesting that there was a time when the angels could be redeem, but after the fall of man, they no longer could be redeemed. So he offers this middle ground, that there was a possibility of redemption for fallen angels, but that possibility was removed from the table after humanity fell. Okay, so does this mean that the Church Fathers disagree? Let's talk a bit about what it means to talk about a consensus of the Fathers. When it comes to the consensus of the Fathers, we are really talking about those things that have to do with the core central doctrines of the Orthodox Church. And these are the sorts of things that we see in the ecumenical councils. When we talk about the nature of man, we do see consensus in the Fathers. When we talk about the condition of man that needs to be redeemed, we do find consensus in the Fathers. When we talk about the nature of the Trinity, we find consensus in the Fathers. When we talk about Christology and the person of Christ, we find consensus of the Fathers. When we talk about the gospel and what Christ has done to redeem us, we find consensus in the Fathers. When we talk about these related topics, the ones that are related directly to Christology, which I mentioned, such as Mariology or iconography, we find consensus in the Fathers. And in that sense, what we find that there is an orthodox position on these core issues of what is Christianity and what is the gospel of Christianity. But there are issues that are around the outside of this, the edge of this, that the Church has no final and definite answer on. The redemption of angels is one such question. This is what is called theologumena. Theologumena is a word that refers to theological opinions. And these are areas where the Church Fathers themselves admit that the Church has no official position on these matters. And some of them speculate. And the ways in which they speculate, some speculate in this way and some speculate in this way. So, for example, the redemption of angels being one thing that I mentioned. It is not a core doctrine having to do with the essence of Christianity or the gospel. And so you find theologumena. You find some Church Fathers speculating on that question, and some saying angels can't be redeemed. Others speculating in different ways, saying maybe they could be redeemed, and others speculating in a middle ground way. And this is something to understand about Orthodoxy, that there are these core doctrines that are most certainly handed down and are part of the essentials of the faith, and those are the things that we see played out in the ecumenical councils. So those doctrines that we see at Nicaea and Constantinople and Ephesus and Chalcedon and so on, those doctrines make very clear to us what the faith is, and that's the reason an ecumenical council was required. Because the ecumenical council itself recognized that this topic is essential to the faith as it's been given over to us. And there is an answer to what has been given over to us. There is a tradition that's been handed down, and there's something we need to protect and preserve. And so when we look at the ecumenical councils, they really help highlight for us what is that core. What is that core when we say, what is Christianity? That question that I was asking, what is Christianity? The ecumenical councils help shape the boundary lines of the answer to that question. And when we look at that, and when we look at the Eastern Fathers, what we see is a clear consensus on that core. We also see that the liturgy itself is another authority that echoes that core. So when we look at the liturgy, we begin to see that same core echo through in the form of worship that is practiced. We see in the canon law the practices of how we live out our spirituality, that same core lived out. We see it in the hymnography. And we also even see it in the iconography. You'll notice that in several of these talks, I refer not only to ancient Near Eastern texts, but even to iconography that reflected the very theology that we were talking about. That all of these things have to do with that lived core. But that's not to say that there are not gray areas where we have variance of opinion. And this is where we have to recognize that there is consensus of the Fathers around that core. There's consensus of the councils around that core. There's consensus of the liturgy around that core. There's consensus of the iconography around that core. But there are gray areas outside of that where you have theologumena, various opinions. And the opinions of the fathers in this way create a second boundary line, a boundary line where it's permissible to agree with John of Damascus in saying that angels can't be redeemed. It's permissible to agree with Pseudo-Dionysius in saying, well, maybe they could be redeemed. And it's permissible to agree with Nemesius of Emesa and say, well, maybe they could be redeemed for a time, but that window is now closed. And this is what it means to talk about consensus of the fathers. So I offer that as one way of looking at this point, because somebody had raised in one of the questions, they had raised, well, how come, but the fathers disagree on certain things. And the answer is not on that core answer to the question, what is Christianity? Yes, you can find disagreements on certain things, but these are things that they recognize stand outside the core of Christianity, outside that central question of the Orthodox faith that's been handed down, and in those gray areas of theologumena, of theological opinion. And in this way, they've set a boundary lines of permissible gradations of speculation in those areas. So I hope that's helpful there. All right, let me look at a few other issues here that were raised. Liturgy was something that came up in some of the questions. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the intent of the liturgy and touch on a couple of points to note. Orthodoxy, when it comes to the liturgy, when we look at the Divine Liturgy, it's important to recognize that Orthodoxy does not leave behind the Jewish liturgy entirely. That in many ways what we see is that in Orthodox Christian worship we see the completion of the liturgy that's been handed down to us. So if we look at the book of Acts, one of the things we recognize is that the early Jewish Christians, right, immediately following the resurrection and the ascension of Christ, they continued to go to synagogue. Right? So they continued to practice their Jewish liturgy as long as they could until they were put out of the synagogue. And they were no longer allowed to practice it. And we also see that they practiced the Eucharist outside of the synagogue worship. And at some point, what emerged was this combining of the two, so that once the Christians were no longer allowed to practice the liturgical synagogue worship, within there, they began to merge these into a new type of liturgy. And this is why in the early church we have certain apostolic liturgies, one written by St. James, for example, as well as these other liturgies that precede John Chrysostom, such as Basil's liturgy. And what you can see is when you look at these, you actually can identify the point at which the old synagogue liturgy converges with the Eucharistic liturgy. You can notice the dividing point within the liturgical practice. And then, as I had mentioned, due to certain controversies, certain other additions were added later, such as the veneration of the Theotokos, so that we are here declaring that Christ is in fact one person against people such as the Nestorians. Now, the reason I think this is significant is because some people within Protestant circles look at the liturgy and they look at the parallels with the Old Testament as a negative thing. I'll give an example, the curtain. Right? The idea that there's a curtain that somehow separates the altar from the people who stand on the other side of it. They would point to the fact, well, that curtain was torn in two, right? It was ripped from top to bottom. And so we shouldn't have that, right? Because in the Protestant mind, there's this idea that everything about Old Testament worship had something to do with a separation between us and God, and that separation has now been broken apart and broken down. What I think is critical to recognize about the liturgy as it was practiced is that it continues to mirror the form of worship that was handed down, but it reflects the new realities. Let's take the curtain or the iconostases as an example. It's true that in the Old Testament, tabernacle and then the temple, that the curtain represented a barrier between you and God, because on that curtain was an icon of an angel with a flaming sword, to remind you that you have been cast out of Eden. Right? That was the thing that you were to be reminded of. Whereas in the iconostasis now, where you have the curtain, you also have icons of either the Annunciation or the four gospel writers, something that reminds you of the incarnation. And so now what happens is that you still have a curtain that reminds you that you are on this side of paradise, and paradise is back there, the heavenly realm, right, is back there. But the difference is, rather than an icon that reminds you of a separation, that you've been cast out of paradise, an angel with a flaming sword, you now have an icon that reminds you that one has reconciled and mediated between God and man, that the heavenly realm has been brought close to us, and we've been reunited through the person of Christ. So what we see in the liturgy is we see this metamorphosis of the old tabernacle worship, that we continue to worship in a way that reflects these forms and is a shadow of the heavenly realm, but those shadows have now shifted because reality has shifted due to the incarnation. Similarly, we have these gold angels. Right now in the Old Testament tabernacle, those gold angels were static. They always remained on the other side of that curtain, stuck to the Ark of the Covenant, where God would come and meet with the priest. Right? But now what we see is that those golden angels, they come out from the heavenly realm, and they follow what? Well, they follow two things: the gospel, when it's brought out, or they follow the Eucharist. In other words, what we recognize is that the bread of heaven has come down to us. Christ himself has entered the midst of the people. And so for that reason, the golden angels who hail, right, God, who sit before the throne of God and veil their faces in the Old Testament tabernacle, now what they do is that they follow the presence of God, but rather than remaining back there, God has come out to the people. So when we see the gospel, which is an icon of Christ, come out, they follow that. When we see the Eucharist, the bread of heaven that has come out to us, they follow that. So again and again what we see is we see in the liturgical context, we see a continuity of one kind, a continuity with these forms of worship that God laid out, this pattern of worship that God laid out. But we see the metamorphosis of those shadows based on the ways in which reality itself has somehow changed. And this is the critical thing to see about the nature of liturgical worship today in its current context. So this was a question of where could someone begin if they wanted to start reading some of the things that I've talked about. Let me just try to name off the top of my head certain works that I think would be excellent places to start if you can get your hands on them. And since you have the internet, a lot of these are available online, so hopefully you could find these. I would highly recommend St. Athanasius and two works by him. One would be On the Incarnation. So this is one of his most famous works that was the first one that I read. I read Against the Heathen and then On the Incarnation. Those were the first two that I was reading from Athanasius. But On the Incarnation is an excellent work that gives you a sense of the gospel according to the Eastern Fathers and touches on so many of the things that we've talked about. The other work that I would highly recommend by Athanasius is The Life of St. Anthony. And so The Life of St. Anthony is an excellent picture of this father of desert monasticism. And it's an excellent insight into the life of one striving to live out this remaking of humanity. So The Life of St. Anthony The biography of St. Anthony is also written by Athanasius. I'd also highly recommend writings by the Cappadocians. The Cappadocians consist of Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory of Nazianzus. So let's start with Basil. Basil of Caesarea, or Basil the Great. On the Holy Spirit is an excellent work of Basil's that I could recommend if you can get your hands on that. Alternatively, no, we'll just leave it at that one. Gregory of Nyssa, I would recommend a couple of different works by Gregory. The one would be a simple letter that he wrote called On Not Three Gods. And this is a treatise about the Trinity. An excellent letter by Gregory about the Trinity. And the reason it's called On Not Three Gods is it's in response to a letter written to him by Ablabius, who's asking if we believe in three gods. And this is Gregory's answer to that. So I'd highly recommend that letter. The other thing I would recommend by Gregory of Nyssa is his great catechism. So he wrote a catechism, the Great Catechism. And I would highly recommend that by Gregory of Nyssa. One of the works that is my favorite work of all time, if I could recommend only one patristic text, only one text by the Church Fathers, this is the one I would recommend. This is from John of Damascus, so 8th century. John of Damascus wrote a treatise called On the Orthodox Faith, or an exact exposition of the Orthodox Faith would be a more accurate translation, but On the Orthodox Faith. This is a summary of the theology of the Church Fathers written by a Church Father. So in the 8th century, John of Damascus sets out to write a work and says, I'm going to add nothing to this of my own. I'm just going to summarize what the Church Fathers have said. And he writes On the Orthodox Faith. It's essentially a systematic theology, right? A summary of theology by the Church Father John of Damascus. It's excellent. It's excellent. And if you were to only read one thing, if you could get your hands on that, that is something well worth reading. Another work by John of Damascus on icons is his 3 treatises on the divine images. So if you're interested in the icon controversy, or what he has to say about icons, that is an excellent work. And one of the things that's very helpful about that work, again, if you can get your hands on it, is that at the end of each treatise, after he goes through and defends icons, John of Damascus also includes quotes from other Church Fathers about icons, so that people know that what he's saying is not his invention. It's the sort of thing that you can find in all the previous Church Fathers. So that's an excellent, excellent treatise. Other works. Pseudo-Dionysius. I would recommend reading Pseudo-Dionysius, specifically his work on the angelic hierarchy. So if you're interested in these hierarchies of angels, right, the celestial hierarchy, Pseudo-Dionysius talks about that. And that would be something worth reading. I would also, and maybe this will be the last one I recommend because I don't want to give you too much to dig for, but I would also highly recommend Irenaeus and Irenaeus' treatise Against Heresies. Now, I will warn you, the treatise begins by talking about the Gnostics, and he spends a lot of time summarizing what the Gnostics have to say about different topics, and it's all very cryptic, and it's all very strange, and it's all very weird. You might skip over that part and just get to where he actually talks about Christian theology. If you can get past all of the strange, all the summary of the strange Gnostic theology, there's really wonderful, wonderful things that you might read in Saint Irenaeus. I guess I would be remiss if I didn't recommend one more. Saint Ignatius of Antioch. So Saint Ignatius, I think it's his letter to the Smyrnians, where he talks about the bishop, he talks about the importance of the Eucharist. Saint Ignatius is definitely somebody who would be worth reading. Maybe what I can do is I can offer to Bishop Danny a list. I've put together a list before, a more extensive list of readings from the Church Fathers that I recommend. And then maybe we could even dig and see if we can find places online where you can access those, and we can include that with the list. And we could share that with some other things. So maybe we can do that, which I think would be very helpful.